800 to speak with Samuel and his guests. And now, here is the host of the Money and Business Show, Samuel Zerzer.
Money, and business. Mark Lyjak, one of the 6 members of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran who escaped the embassy when it was attacked in 1979 and were sheltered by the Canadian diplomat. The story is loosely told in the film Argo, and Mark Lyjak would like to offer on the Money and Business Show a special edition and his first-hand account of what actually happened in Iran and how they escaped from Tehran. Mark will fill in some gaps in the true story about the courageous Canadian contribution to their safekeeping and eventual departure, which I think were underplayed in the film Argo. Mark Lyjak served as a minor consultant to Argo and is the author of The House Guest, a memoir of Canadian courage, and CIA sorcery, as well as a number of articles dealing with the Canadian role in his escape. The 2012 film Argo, which won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, is his fictionalized cinematic representation of the operation, which includes elements of both facts and fiction. My name is Samuel Zerzer, your host to the Money and Business Show on Radio Shalom CJRS 1650 AM. Thank you for tuning in live on the Money Business Show with our studio's headquarters in Montreal and financial capital and the home of the greatest hockey team, the Montreal Canadiens. We have another great show for you today, and as always, you can call if you have any questions, comments, or even criticism on today's topic. Please call us directly at 514-738-4100 extension 200, or you can email me at moneyandbusinessshow@gmail.com if you have any inquiries. You can also visit our website and listen live there at www.radio-shalom.ca. All our shows are archived there. Today's topic is Argo, what really happened in Tehran, and where the Canadians, the real heroes. Today we're doing a special edition on the Money Business Show. We're not going to be talking about business. We're going to be talking about foreign affairs. We're going live to Washington State, city called Anacortes, to speak with Mark Lyjak, one of the 6 members of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran who escaped the embassy when it was attacked in 1979, and were sheltered by diplomats, and we're going to hear his side of the events that led to his escape and eventual movie Argo. So today, I will introduce Mark Lyjak. He's a retired Foreign Service officer whose career began in Iran just prior to 1979 hostage crisis. One of the 6 Americans able to escape the compound and find refuge with the staff of the Canadian Embassy. He and his wife, Cora, eventually fled Iran with CIA assistance. The story of the escape became the basis of the 2013 Best Picture winning film Argo. After Iran, Lyjak remained in the Foreign Service with assignments in Hong Kong, Nepal, Poland, and Germany. And as well, in Washington, D.C., he holds a bachelor's degree from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and an MBA from the American University. He and his wife reside in Washington State and have 2 grown children. Lyjak served as a minor consultant to Argo and is the author of The House Guest, a memoir of Canadian courage and CIA sorcery, as well as a number of articles dealing with the Canadian role in his escape.
Actions of Iran have shocked the civilized world. For a government to applaud mob violence and terrorism, for a government actually to support and in effect participate in the taking and the holding of hostages is unprecedented in human history. This violates not only the most fundamental precepts of international law, but the common ethical and religious heritage of humanity. There is no recognized religious faith on earth which condones kidnapping. There is no recognized religious faith on earth which condones blackmail. There is certainly no religious faith on earth which condones the sustained abuse of innocent people. We are deeply concerned about the inhuman and degrading conditions imposed on the hostages. From every corner of the world, nations and people have voiced their strong revulsion and condemnation of Iran and have joined us in calling for the release of the hostages.
Good afternoon. How are you, Mark?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
Thanks for having me on.
Yes, and welcome to the Money and Business Show on Radio Shalom. That was Jimmy Carter, response to the hostage taking, very much concerned and very angry, of course. Mark, just take us through what happened in 1979 in Tehran, and why were you in Tehran?
Well, I was on my first assignment. I had just joined the Foreign Service in October of '78, and when you're a new guy, they don't give you much choice where to go.
Right.
I was asked to volunteer for Tehran. They were trying to essentially rebuild our presence there after an earlier takeover that had occurred in February of '79. Most of the staff had been evacuated after that, and those folks obviously didn't want to go back, and it wasn't seen as reasonable to send them. So I was part of the second wave of new people to come in. If I can just make one comment regarding Carter's statement.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a very fundamental error in it, and I think it was fundamental to how we ended up in the mess we were in. He talks about the government of Iran. No government has done this, no government has done that. The embassy was actually telling the State Department, and of course indirectly President Carter, that there was no government period in Iran, and they refused to believe it, and that's one of the reasons why things developed as they developed.
So basically, what you're saying is that they weren't listening. The American government wasn't listening at that time, and they didn't take it seriously. Is that right?
Well, they didn't take the embassy reporting seriously
right.
enough.
Okay.
The embassy, when I got to Iran in July of '79, one of the first things that I became aware of, even as a very junior guy, was that the embassy believed that the so-called provisional government of Iran, which was made up of basically secular, moderate, Western-educated Democrats, was a figurehead. It really had no authority. All meaningful authority rested with the Ayatollah Khomeini. Washington refused to accept that. They were very much invested in the idea that a moderate democratic government could emerge from the chaos in Iran, and they were sending us and other people there for the purpose of trying to build a relationship with that new government. And of course, the embassy was saying, there's no there. So, and they were right. Unfortunately, it took the hostage taking to prove it.
So take us through what happened. I mean, when they, obviously they went into the embassy, the students, the mob, and so on. Just tell us what happened.
Well, on the morning of November 4th, 1979, it was basically a normal work day, except there'd been a big demonstration the weekend prior and a lot of graffiti on our walls. So luckily for us, the charge, the acting ambassador, closed the tourist visa unit, and he went to the foreign ministry to demand more security. He was at the foreign ministry at the point when people started climbing the gates, and shortly thereafter the compound was overrun by a mob. And fortunately, again for us, they focused on the Chancery building, which was in the south center of the compound. The compound was huge, 26 acres. Our building was about a 5-minute walk to the northwest, and after waiting a couple of hours, during which time we were pretty much left alone. One effort to break in through an upstairs bathroom was repelled by our Marine. The word finally came that we should try to go to the British Embassy. Now, we had a direct entrance to the street that normally would have been used by this mob of tourist visa applicants, but fortunately, since we weren't doing visa interviews that day in protest, there was nobody out there. We didn't know for sure what would happen when we opened that door, but we knew that there wouldn't be a big crowd. Marine opened it. One of our guys went out, came back, said there's 3 policemen out there, but they say we can leave. And so we did. We broke up into 2 groups, a dozen or so Americans that were left after all of the Iranians were sent out, and we were trying to make our way to the British when we encountered yet another demonstration. And at that point, the senior guy in our group, a fellow named Bob Anders, who's also one of the 6 in the movie, suggested that we all go to his house because it was in the neighborhood, and besides, it was raining, and we felt pretty vulnerable wandering around out there. So we did that, and let me just end by saying at this point we were thinking that this was going to be a repeat of that February Valentine's Day takeover, which only lasted 3 hours, and the government would come to our rescue. So once we made it to Bob's apartment, we were feeling pretty good. We thought, hey, we can stay here, we can wait this out, the government will send military or police or somebody, and they'll give us back our compound within hours, hopefully, maybe a day at the worst, and that was our view.
So basically you were waiting for the government or Jimmy Carter at that time, who was the president of the United States, to come to the rescue, but it didn't happen that way, right? You guys were hoping for...
That's right.
Okay. And how long did that hoping last? Because it was like a day or two. When did you realize that, hey, I'm a hostage?
Well, I would say hostage was too strong a word for us. The Canadians like to say we could have left their residences anytime we felt like it. But anyway, it was a gradual process. We were the first day we were at Bob's apartment until evening. We went over to the cultural center, spent the night there on the phone to the department. The next day we moved first to the apartment of Joe and Kathy Stafford, who are also 2 of the 6 depicted in Argo. Spent the day there. We moved on to the British Embassy that night. This was actually the scariest period for me because we were on the move constantly. The British kicked us out after one night, I should say, and at the time they didn't explain, and this is a mystery to me why they didn't tell us that it was for our own good. Apparently a mob had turned up at the compound where we were hiding, and it was only thanks to the clever strategy of a Pakistani guard who managed to persuade the mob there was no one there and that they should go downtown, and that's where everybody was being held at the British Embassy.
So were you telling me that the British Embassy kicked you out? Or they just say it's just too risky to have you, and we don't want this happening to our embassy?
Well, no, it wasn't. It's a combination of those. They kicked us out, but they did so in consultation with Washington, and both our people and their people agreed that their situation was simply too risky. After the United States, Britain is probably the most hated nation in Iran, and so for us to hide with the British made no sense. I just wish they'd told us that at the time, because the following morning when we were put back into the house of a hostage, we did feel betrayed by the British, and we did not understand the reasons for their actions. Obviously, once we got to Washington, we understood it all, and at this stage, I would agree it was the right thing to do, but at the time, we felt very much abandoned, and even though our Deputy Chief of Mission, one of the 3 people being held at the Foreign Ministry, did make arrangements for us to get some help. We had his housekeeper was really taking care of us, but we were in a house that belonged to a hostage. The record of that house was kept on the embassy compound, and I figured it was only a matter of time before the occupiers would find those files and send people out to check the houses. So never got very comfortable in that house. We stayed there for 4 nights, but it was during that time that Bob Anders made the contact with his friend and counterpart at the Canadian Embassy, a fellow named John Sheardown. And John was extremely welcoming. His initial comment back to Bob was, "Why didn't you call sooner?" And Bob said, well, it's not just me, there's 5 of us. And John said, bring them all. And I mean, he didn't just say it. I mean, it was very emphatic, almost an order. And John was, ex-military and pretty good at giving orders. So anyway, we didn't go because of 2 things. One, we knew whoever took us in would be taking a big risk, and we didn't want to impose. We still, at this point, had vague hopes that maybe somehow the crisis would blow over. And also because of what the British had done, we felt a little bit wary of trusting foreign embassies. We didn't realize that the Canadians were much more trustworthy than the British, and that we didn't have anything to worry about. But in fact, the British did have good reasons. As I said, it wasn't like Argo says. Argo makes a slap at both the Brits and the New Zealanders, and neither was deserved. The New Zealanders were wonderful, second only to the Canadians in terms of the help they gave us.
In the business headquarters of Radio Shalom, 1650 AM in Montreal, with the Money and Business Show. You have questions about your personal finances? You need advice in making sound financial decisions? Samuel and his guests are ready to take your call at 514-738-4100, extension 200. And now, back to the Money and Business Show.
We're back with a special edition of the Money and Business Show on Radio Shalom CJR 1650 AM. We're back with Mark Lyjak, one of the 6 members of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran who escaped the embassy when it was attacked in 1979. He also wrote a book, The House Guest, a memoir of Canadian courage and CIA sorcery. We're going to be hearing a clip here of the First Lady, Michelle Obama. Actually, I was a little surprised to hear that she was in the Oscar, but we're just going to hear a clip.
And now for the moment we have all been waiting for. And the Oscar goes to Argo. Argo has 7 Academy Award nominations this year, winning 3 Oscars, Film Editing, Adapted Screenplay, and Best Picture.
Mark, I was actually surprised, the First Lady Michelle Obama, announcing the Oscar. Weren't you surprised? Did you see it, by the way?
I did see that part, and I was surprised, and frankly, I don't much like the idea of mixing politics and the arts, and it's not because it's Michelle Obama. I thought it was just kind of a little too much.
Okay, so Mark, what was your role in the film Argo?
Well, I say minor consultant for 2 reasons. One, they didn't pay me a lot, and 2,
that's a minor. That's a real minor consultant.
That's right, and I do want to make deflect. I guess you might say protect myself a little bit from accusations that I signed on to the depiction of the Canadian role in particular as it is, because in fact I didn't. I tried as best I could to.
We'll get to that later. Yeah, we'll get to that later. I'm going to ask you on that, on the Canadian role and so on. But so your actual was a minor consultant?
Well, what I did primarily, other than talk to the actor who played me, as I worked with the historian for the film, trying to, I sent him maps of the compound, layouts of the buildings, things like that, to give them an understanding of how things actually went down on the compound that day. So that was my main role. So, you know what, I know that was your main role, but did you get paid for it? Obviously not, right? Well, no, I got paid, but it wasn't, wasn't a huge, not what I consider Hollywood money. You mean you didn't get a cut off the percentage of Argo? Come on, you would have been a millionaire by now. No way, no. I'm not even sure Tony Bennett got a percentage. I can't believe it. So Ben Affleck took everything, right? I can't believe it. Oh. Well, you know what? Ben Affleck doesn't own that movie. George Clooney does. Oh, it's George Clooney. It's an interesting thing. Oh. Yeah, Ben Affleck, his person, his number one assistant, told me that they are hired help as far as Argo is concerned. That the film belongs to George Clooney's company and to a certain extent Warner Brothers, and they were basically hired to produce and direct it. Wow, I'm just a little surprised you're getting a percentage, but you know what? Let's go on to the next question here, because we're going to hear Jimmy Carter on the Canadian role. But this is what I want to talk about a little bit on this segment. The Canadian role. Go ahead. The movie role played by the American hero
He was only there a day and a half. Ken Taylor and them were there through the whole thing. And so when the Americans escaped, contrary to the very vivid end in the movie that brought me to the edge of my seat as well when I watched it, where this pickup truck outran a jet airplane taking off. I'm not criticizing Hollywood, but nobody ever knew that the 6 Americans had been in the Canadian embassy until they were safe in Switzerland. And my wife and I were invited to go to Queen's College in Canada last fall to receive honorary doctorate degrees, which we did. And so I watched Argo before I went because I knew that Ken Taylor and Flora MacDonald were going to be in the audience. They had also seen the film. And my judgment is that 90% of the credit for that heroic and brilliant move should have been with the Canadians. And the movie ignores practically any contribution by the Canadians. So, but aside from that, it's a vivid, wonderful film.
So, Mark, you heard former President Jimmy Carter. Actually, he was a little funny there. You know, what was it? The Jeep trying to outrun the jet airplane. I couldn't believe that either in the movie. But Mark, as a minor consultant, why weren't you able to prevent deviations from the history that led to the diminishment of the Canadian role? As a related point, why did Affleck or Banner profess interest in stressing the international nature of the rescue effort, resulting in the film that focused just primarily on the CIA role, not the Canadian role? Why?
Those are good questions, and I really wish I could answer them. The person that was our primary liaison was Ben Affleck's right-hand assistant, and she was up there on the stage, one of the people receiving the Best Picture Oscar. So I mean, I know she is influential. Now, why the comments that my wife and I were making on the version of the script that we saw didn't register? I'm not sure. I was a little bit taken aback that nothing got changed based on what we said, and furthermore, basically surprised that Ben was surprised that the film got the kind of response it did in Canada, because we told him it would. I mean, we were pretty explicit about, the Canadians who are old enough to remember this are going to know that their role was considerably greater than the film gives them credit for, and there will be a bad reaction. But for whatever reason, I guess once the scriptwriter got into it, he was left to write whatever he wanted to write, and the consequences to be dealt with later.
As Jimmy Carter said, really the CIA was there for like a day and a half, but the Canadians were there for 3 months. And this is what perplexed me when I saw the movie Argo, and I went into the details, and I went to the history books and so on, and I found out the Canadian role was completely diminished on the movie.
Well, there are a number of ways to look at it, but that's certainly a fair summary. The CIA did invest more than a day and a half. I mean, building the Hollywood scenario took quite a bit of time, and I think it was a good scenario for us as far as giving us something we could sink our teeth into, so to speak, when it came time to leave Iran. But clearly the Canadian role was greater, and the man who kind of made it all possible, John Sheardown, doesn't even rate a mention in the film.
At all, practically, yes.
Well, he's not there. He's not there, even, right. Not as a character or even as someone who's referred to, which was kind of what I was hoping they would do, is at least make passing reference to John and Zena, but also to the fact, for example, that the driver's licenses and health cards and things like that were prepared, as I understand it, by the RCMP, not by the CIA. Yet the Canadians are shown providing only the passports, which was, again, necessary and fundamental, but not the sum total of the stuff we needed to look like real Canadians.
So, Mark, why did you write the book, The House Guest? It's The House Guest, a memoir of Canadian courage and CIA sorcery. What shortcomings in the film convinced you to put the story on record? Is it still a Canadian caper?
Well, that's primarily it. I thought it is the Canadian caper, and I am not sure that it would have been a good idea for the Canadian embassy to try to exfiltrate us on their own. But at the same time, I believe that if it had come down to needing to do that, that somehow they would have figured out a way. It made sense to bring the CIA into it. They did have the expertise, but I do think that it wasn't, if there had been some sort of crisis, it turned out that the CIA could not be used for whatever reason. I still have confidence we would have gotten out.
Mark, what aspect of the film Argo did you find especially moving or effective?
Well,
okay. Besides watching you on the screen itself, but which?
No, that always makes me squirm a little bit when I watch myself. What I liked was the opening scenes. I thought were very powerful. The way it really brought back to me the day of the attack. The breaching of the wall. What I did not see, fortunately, because I wasn't in the chancery, but the process of the occupiers moving room by room, taking the staff there hostage, putting on the blindfolds and the handcuffs, that was very moving to me, as well as the mock execution later, which underlined how badly the hostages were treated by their captors. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that. How much pain and suffering these people were put through. That's one thing I don't understand. I understand the politics. I don't understand the sadism, I guess, basically. That's the only word that seems to fit it.
Fair enough. So Mark, just stay on the line. We're going to be going through our second break here. We have Mark Lyjak, one of the 6 members of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, who escaped the embassy when it was attacked in 1979. And also, he wrote a book called The House Guest, a memoir of Canadian courage and CIA sorcery. Again, my name is Samuel Zerzer for the Money and Business Show on Radio Shalom CJRS 1650 AM in Montreal. We'll be right back in 2 minutes.
We're back, live in studio with Samuel Zerzer in the business headquarters of Radio Shalom 1650 AM in Montreal with the Money and Business Show. You have questions about your personal finances? You need advice in making sound financial decisions? Samuel and his guests are ready to take your call at 514-738-4100, extension 200. And now, back to the Money and Business Show.
We're back with Mark Lyjak, actually Washington, D.C. We're going live there. Mark Lyjak, one of the 6 members of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran who escaped the embassy when it was attacked in 1979 and were sheltered by the Canadian diplomats. Also, he wrote a book called The House Guest, Memoir of Canadian Courage and CIA Sorcery. And today's subject is Argo. What really happened in Tehran, and were the Canadians the real heroes? Mark, we spoke about what you liked about the movie. What didn't you like about the movie Argo?
Well, obviously...
Or what did you like least, I would say. What did you like least? Okay, we'll put it that way.
Well, what I liked least was what wasn't there, I guess you'd have to say. Any reference to the shear downs, the bad-mouthing of the New Zealanders and the Brits, who, we did have, at the time, the Brits had turned us away, and that was a concern, obviously, but it turned out they helped in other ways, and it was not a bad, it was an appropriate decision at in the circumstances of the moment. So to slam them unnecessarily, I thought, there are countries who actually refuse to help. The Germans, for example, I'm told, were asked and said no, so why not make it factual? And I did talk to Tony Mendez about some of that, and Tony said it wasn't under his control either. It just seems to be kind of a mystery, because it was his book that was used as the primary. He's given a screenwriter credit for his book, and the fact is that he knows very well the New Zealanders helped him tremendously, and he recognizes that in his book, and yet somehow in the movie it gets flipped around, and I just don't get that. And honestly, I'm no expert on Hollywood. I presume somebody thought that it needed to be that way, but I sure don't understand it.
But Mark, there were a few inaccuracies. There was no crisis at the airport as depicted in the movie. Climatic scene, if you remember, like what Jimmy Carter said, truck outrunning a jet plane.
Yeah.
Well, it's unheard of. And no one was considering closing the Canadian embassy as well. And the fugitives never went to the bazaar.
Well, that actually, the bazaar scene I understand as being dramatic license, but you're absolutely correct about that. The comment, and I should have mentioned that the comment that the Canadians are going to close the embassy was absurd, and it didn't need to be there. And it reflected poorly on the people who were doing so much for us. In fact, there was a concern on the part of the Canadians, the same concern we had, that after coming on close to 3 months, we'd been pushing our luck too much. It was time to get out of there. And the Canadians understood that, we understood it, and we weren't sure that Washington did. And so Ottawa was telling Washington, hey, you guys need to get organized and figure out a way to extract these folks. And that was very reasonable. It wasn't a sign of cowardice. It was a sign of common sense.
And Mark, you know what, before I get to the next question, explain why the movie Argo. I know we spoke about a little bit, yesterday, a little bit why the movie Argo, but the scene was perfect, right? I mean, a desert, it was supposed to be a science fiction movie, is that right? Why this plot, a science fiction plot?
Well, I think the idea being that Hollywood people are out of touch with reality, and to a greater extent than most, and that they would be crazy enough, I guess, to use that word, to go to Iran in the middle of a revolution and try to do a location shoot.
That was insane.
Scout. For any other businessman, going to Iran would have been
suicidal.
Maybe you're a weapons merchant. It would be a really dumb thing to do.
So, okay, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that was the premise of the Hollywood scenario, and it was one that we agreed with and bought into.
Why? Because a science fiction movie, like there was a desert in Iran, or there's devastation in Iran. Is that why?
Yes, Tony described the film as Buck Rogers in the desert, and there's a need for old ruins in a desert setting, and Persepolis was a perfect fit for that. So even though that's not mentioned in the film, it's my understanding that that's where, in theory, we were supposed to have been trying to get to, but we were supposed to tell, if asked, that the Canadian ambassador had told us circumstances were not right to try to do that, and we should return later to do our scouting. So that would be our excuse for actually not having gone to Persepolis, but that was the scenery that we needed for the film, is my understanding, and so it makes perfect sense, in a kind of perverse way that if you need Iran for the movie, you need Iran. So you need Persepolis, and you go where you need to go, and it doesn't matter whether there's a revolution or not.
Right, exactly.
To a movie producer, this might actually sound like the title of a very bad movie, The Islamic Republic of Iran versus Hollywood. But the way things are shaping up, there could technically be a chance that we could see an Iran-Hollywood matchup in court. That is because the Iranian government has announced plans to sue Hollywood over the Oscar-winning movie Argo, about the CIA's rescue of several American citizens during the 1979 hostage crisis. The Iranian government never liked this movie. Officials in Tehran said it was CIA Washington propaganda designed to undermine the Islamic Republic of Iran by distorting the reality of Iran, depicting the country as a dark and hateful place and fueling Iranophobia, the fear of Iran. Critics in Iran also say the movie doesn't properly explain Iran's grievances that led to the storming of the U.S. embassy, namely the CIA's role in the toppling of Iran's democratically elected government back in 1953, something a lot of Americans don't know about. Iran has criticized plenty of Hollywood movies in the past, like the movie 300 and Not Without My Daughter. But now it looks like they're taking it up a notch with threats of a lawsuit. They've also hired, apparently, French activist and lawyer Isabelle Couton-Perret, who's in Iran right now, according to state media. It's not clear if Iran's going to go through with this lawsuit, and if so, what court would hear it, and how Hollywood will react. We'll keep an eye on things and bring you the suspenseful ending. Reza Sayah, CNN, Cairo.
Mark, I just wanted to put that in because the Iranian government did not like the movie, obviously, and they want to sue Hollywood or America or whatever. I don't know if they stand a chance or not, but what do you think of the history of the Iranian-American relations as explained in Argo? You give the film credit for trying to put the hostage crisis into historical context, but how valid is the context proposed by the film, as we heard in the clip? You know, Iran not happy about the film.
Well, I think I understand their unhappiness. I mean, the film does portray Iran in a dark manner, but frankly, it's very accurate in the sense that even before the embassy takeover, when I had to go to the airport to meet people or whatever, the way that airport is depicted in the film is pretty much the way I felt when I was there. You never knew which of these Revolutionary Committee guys walking around with the AK-47s was going to dislike the look of your face and cause you trouble. I mean, that part of the portrayal is pretty darn accurate, and I don't. If it went to a jury, I think the jury would find that the movie is relatively fair in how it treats Iran at that time. As far as the history part, I do think they made an effort. Obviously, they can't devote much time to it, but if anything, they went to the Iranian side. I mean, I think there's a counter view that, in fact, the coup that the CIA is alleged to have staged occurred in large measure because the man. The Prime Minister, Mossadegh, was an inept politician, and he had alienated a big chunk of his base even before the CIA made it their mission to dislodge him. So you can make an argument that there's, the Iranians have a tendency to blame foreigners for all their troubles, and I think in this case, the CIA definitely stuck its nose where it didn't belong, but on the other hand, Mossadegh did a lot of it to himself. And the other thing I'd add, of course, is it was the Cold War, and back in those days, anything that hinted of Soviet expansionism, and there was belief in many quarters that Mossadegh was a communist, there was a great fear that Iran would end up in the Soviet orbit. And from our perspective today, that doesn't justify what we did, but back at the time, we did a lot of things like that, trying to, save the world from communism. You can laugh now, but back then we took it seriously.
Well, no kidding, of course, but I'm just a little surprised the Iranian government would actually take the movie seriously. I mean, most people know, there's some facts there, and it's also fictional. It's Hollywood. I mean, they're really taking it personally.
Well, they are. And they're being silly. For example, there was a press release shortly after the report that you played where the Iranians claimed that the foreign ministry actually escorted the six of us to the airport and that we exited Iran using our U.S. diplomatic passports under foreign ministry escort. Now, that is a complete and total fabrication, it's Looney Tunes. And so if that's going to be their argument in court, more power to them.
Anyways, Mark, just stay on the line. We have Mark Lyjak, live Washington, D.C., one of the 6 members of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran who escaped the embassy when it was attacked in 1979, sorry about that, and were sheltered by Canadian diplomats. Again, my name is Samuel Zerzer for the Money Mission Radio. I'm CJRS 1650 AM Montreal. We'll be right back.
We're back, live in studio with Samuel Zerzer together in the business headquarters of Radio Shalom 1650 AM in Montreal with the Money and Business Show. You have questions about your personal finances? You need advice in making sound financial decisions? Samuel and his guests are ready to take your call at 514-738-4100, extension 200. And now, back to the Money and Business Show.
We welcome back Mark Lyjak, one of the 6 members of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, who escaped the embassy when it was attacked in 1979 and was sheltered by the Canadian diplomats. Also, he is an author of The House Guest and Memoir of Canadian Courage and CIA Sorcery. Our topic today is Argo, what really happened in Tehran, and were the Canadians the real heroes. Mark, I'm going to ask you what you think of President Carter, but before that, we're going to be hearing a clip. Jimmy Carter, he was at a Commonwealth event sharing his views on the hostage crisis. Go ahead.
I was on the Piers Morgan show, and he's here in California to report on the Oscar presentations tonight, and that's why he concentrated on this particular issue. As a matter of fact, I was present when the hostages were taken in Iran, as most of you old enough would remember, and I was informed immediately that 6 of our hostages were not taken in the compound by the Iranians. They escaped. They went to 2 or 3 other places. And, for instance, the British and some others wouldn't take them in, so they finally wound up in the Canadian embassy and the DCM's office where they were taken in. And the Canadians were in great potential trouble then, because all of their diplomats could also have been taken hostage if they had been caught protecting Americans. And so Ken Taylor was the ambassador there, and Flora MacDonald was the foreign minister for Canada. I was faced with a very difficult position, too, because I wanted to keep it absolutely secret. And we finally worked out an agreement between the CIA and the Canadians that the American hostages would escape using Canadian passports. But you can imagine the difficulty, legally speaking, for the Canadian Parliament to issue false passports. So the entire Parliament had to go into secret session, the only time they've ever done that in history, and they did, and they voted to issue the 6 false passports. And they kept it secret. So the false passports went over there, and the hostages were permitted to leave.
That's a surprise to me that the first time the government ever went into secret session. But what do you first time? But anyways, I'll take his word. What do you think of President Carter's response to the attack on the embassy? Was there more effective policy options available to the United States at that time?
I think there were, but of course it's impossible to assess in hindsight. I guess what I would say is that the Iranians were basically told by President Carter that as long as they did not kill the hostages, he would not take military action against Iran. And the initial plan, as we understand it, for the smaller group of attackers who really intended to take hostages was to hold them for 2 or 3 days. But once they realized that the U.S. would not respond in a more direct and devastating manner, that 3 days turned out to be 444. And I think, unfortunately, President Carter was trapped, if you will, by his own words. It's one thing, I mean, I agree that getting the hostages back safely was important, but I've had hostages, former hostages, tell me that they themselves believe that a more aggressive response, even one that risked their lives by making clear to the Iranians that we were prepared to do that in order to end the crisis, protect U.S. foreign policy interests, and so forth, they would have preferred that. They would have accepted the risk. As it was, President Carter says in the voiceover at the end of Argo, he brought everybody home safe and sound, and that really irritates me because you look at not just the PTSD that some of these folks are dealing with, but there's been at least one suicide I'm aware of, a number of people that are losing battles with alcoholism. Others who say they still don't know what the health consequences will be for them long term, and of course a close personal friend who died from multiple sclerosis that was ultimately determined to be related to stress he endured in Tehran. So it wasn't everybody home safe and sound. Everybody came home they weren't shot over there. That I'll give President Carter credit for, but the reality is they suffered tremendously, and some of them are still suffering, and so it wasn't a cost-free option just to leave them there until the Iranians were through with them, and that's effectively what we did.
Okay.
We didn't negotiate anything. The Iranians let them go when they were done with them.
Mark, on January 20, 1981, Ted Koppel, if you remember him, reports on the last-minute efforts of President Jimmy Carter to secure the release of the American hostages in Iran prior to the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. Let's just hear a clip.
For Jimmy Carter, day 444 begins just as the last 2 days have begun. Without sleep, exhausted, surrounded by aides in the Oval Office, President Carter is desperately trying to salvage this symbolic victory for his administration, to free the 52 American hostages before Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office at noon. The first good news comes at 3:17 a.m. The Iranians have accepted the plan to transfer some $8 billion in Iranian assets, frozen in U.S. banks, to Iran via a bank in London. While the money is Iranian, it is nevertheless a form of ransom. The plan is mobilized. 6:47 a.m. Treasury Secretary William Miller calls. The electronic transfer of funds from U.S. banks to London is complete.
Right on, man. That's great. That's great.
The Oval Office vigil continues. Carter breaks to dress for the inauguration. There is still no inkling of the irony that lies ahead. For Jimmy Carter, who had himself become a captive of the hostage crisis, there is still hope that the hostages will be freed while he is still in office. 11 a.m. The president and the president-elect leave the White House together en route to the inauguration ceremony. Carter is receiving updates by telephone in the presidential limousine, and still no hostage release.
Well, Mark, it's good to hear Ted Koppel from ABC in those days. I found him a great reporter. But what do you think of the failed rescue operation and the ransom before the Ronald Reagan took office?
Well, the rescue operation was something that probably shouldn't have been tried unless the president was really committed to making it work. And it seems to me, and I know there are other versions of this, but they didn't put enough resources into it. They needed 6 operational helicopters. They sent 8, and given the tremendous difficulty of getting those choppers to where they were needed, that was obviously insufficient redundancy. The military said so. I think the president was torn. He really didn't want to do the military option, and so he did it sort of halfway, and we all know what happens. Half measures rarely succeed.
It was an embarrassment to the United States. I was young, and I remember watching it on television, ABC, wherever it was. I remember how embarrassed Jimmy Carter was in those days.
Well, it was devastating to him, I think, both personally and politically. I mean, he's a good man. I certainly have that belief, and I think the fact that 8 people died was very difficult for him. The reality is that the operation didn't have the resources it needed. And as far as the ransom, again, I've had people tell me, including some of the former hostages, that they believe a lot of the terrorism we've had to deal with since the hostage crisis is due to the fact that it was an unqualified win for the Iranians. I mean, in any way that you want to define it, they came out the winners. We lost. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. This was, and in particular, they had a personal vendetta against Carter, and that's why the hostages were held until 30 minutes after Reagan was sworn in. Then the aircraft was allowed to leave.
Unbelievable. I can't believe it. It's 30 minutes before the inauguration. But, Mark, a former Canadian ambassador to Iran, Ken Taylor, said we had a responsibility for taking care of the fugitives, and the CIA was a junior partner. That's what he said, a junior partner. Much of the behind-the-scenes drama took place in Ottawa. Joe Clark, Canada's prime minister at that time, took a big risk by opting to shelter the U.S. fugitive. What do you think of Joe Clark? And also, what about Trudeau at that time? He was in the opposition, if I remember. He was in the opposition, Trudeau.
Right. I've never met Joe Clark, but from everything I know, he's an honorable man, and he certainly did do the right thing by us. As far as Trudeau, I'm not sure, because I have been told that Trudeau was playing politics with our situation. He was criticizing the Clark government for not being insufficiently supportive of the U.S. in diplomatic fora of various kinds, while knowing that the low profile that Clark was trying to keep was because of us. And other people have told me that he had to do that.
Yeah, the Prime Minister couldn't talk at that time. It was a secret operation. And Trudeau was like,
exactly.
He was like, hey, bashing him, all just for political wins.
Well, that's certainly the way it looked to me, and still does, but I've had other people who are defenders of Trudeau say that, well, if he hadn't done that, then it would have been suspicious. It would have looked funny if he'd all of a sudden gone soft on Clark, and maybe there's some validity in that, but I don't buy it myself. I think he realized he had Clark over a barrel, and he took advantage of it, and the consequences to us were apparently not relevant to him, and that's sad.
You know what? I'm going to ask you one last question. Maybe this is. I think we have a couple of minutes left. I just want to say this is so much information, and I want to thank you for coming on to our show. But have you been back to Iran? And would you go back? I don't know if that's a fair question, but would you go back to Iran?
I have not been back because I was told many years ago that I was on an arrest list, and I've never been told that I've been taken off the arrest list.
Oh, is that right?
Now,
wow.
If times changed, or the circumstances in Iran changed, I should say, I would consider going back. I think the Iranian people are lovely, wonderful people, warm people. I enjoyed my time there before politics got in the way, and if there were an opportunity where I could go back safely, then I would. I like to joke. I hope they invite me for the premiere of their version of Argo.
Yes.
Maybe I'll go if I get the appropriate guarantees.
Why not? Maybe you'll get a higher percentage there. You never know.
Well, that's
there we
true.
go.
Maybe they'll need a consultant on this end.
Right.
I'm available.
Right, exactly. But Mark, I really want to thank you for talking to coming to us live at Washington D.C. at your home, talking to us about what happened in 1975 and in Iran and so on. Thank you very much for keeping us to date. Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's been fun. Good, thank you. That was Mark Lyjak, one of the 6 members of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran who escaped the embassy when it was attacked in 1979 and was sheltered by the Canadian diplomats. Also, he is the book author of The House Gets, a memoir of Canadian courage and CIA sorcery. And again, my name is Samuel Izurza for the Money and Biz Show on Radio Shalom, CJRS 1650 AM in Montreal. Happy capitalism. God bless you all.